Hi, everyone, and welcome to Last Week This Morning, where Mark and I recap Energy Media's top stories from last week. And for me, I think the thing that's coming out loud and clear is the energy transition is definitely happening now. And our leaders, the Canadian leaders, are really ignoring the major shifts happening globally around us. Maybe we can start there, Markham.
Well, this is really what we're doing is framing the energy conversation in Canada differently because for a long time it's been all about oil and gas and whether we should export more, export to different customers, should we build out LNG, and there's very little discussion in Canada about what the global energy transition well underway. But, we just don't even, we rarely talk about it, or we talk
Yeah.
about maybe electric vehicles, we talk something like that, but we don't talk about the big shift that's coming. So I want to frame it this way first. And that is we've got, fossil fuels still make up 80% of the global primary energy demand. That's been going on for a long time. And the oil and gas bulls, those who have, the rosy optimistic view, believe that all new sources of energy, which would be electricity generated by wind and solar and whatever else we come up with, they really believe that will follow the same pattern as we did after post World War II, and the new energy will just simply be added to. None
Right.
of that new energy is going to push the old energy out of the system. But then there's another view, and we interviewed, the folks at Ember Energy, Kingsmill Bond and Richard Black and Dan Walter. And I've interviewed Chris Bataille, who's a Canadian energy economist. And so we talked to a lot of people who say, no, we're coming up to an inflection point where all of these new technologies that generate clean, low-cost electricity have been taking all the new demand, right? The load growth, the demand for energy has been taken by those technologies. And in a few years, they're going to be at the point where they take all of the growth and they're going to start eating into with fossil fuels percentage of primary energy demand. And then the fossil fuels are going to begin to decline, maybe 2030 in the early 2030s. So there's two very stark views here. And in Canada, we only talk about one. And we know we're only talking about one because we've done some of the work over the last few weeks. And so let me summarize that. I emailed the federal government, Department of Natural Resources, and I asked them, Minister Tim Hodgson is very bullish on LNG, very bullish on more oil exports. So is the Prime Minister, Mark Carney. Which scenarios of the energy future are they
Yeah.
reviewing? What's the justification for their very strong, supportive public statements for oil and gas? And it came back. The answer is mostly the International Energy's STEPS scenario. And so there are three scenarios. STEPS is the most conservative, status quo, basically not much is going to change out to 2050. The APS scenario shows for both oil and gas, a peak in around 2030, and then sometime in the early 2030s you begin a decline, and it really declines quite a bit to 2050. And then you have the third one is the net zero, where it's basically how do we get to net zero? You assume net zero, and then you have to figure out the policies and technologies to get
Required.
there.
Hmm.
So the reply back from NRCan was we use the STEPS scenario, and then we consult other forecasting agencies, like Canadian Energy Regulator and U.S. But those are all fairly conservative forecasting agencies. They're not talking to Ember Energy, and they're not talking to Bloomberg NEF and so on, where you get a different point of view. And so the federal government's view of the energy future is essentially formed by conservative status quo visions of the energy future. Now, I also asked the same question of the BC government, and we got the answer back because they're mostly LNG, not oil. And they
Right.
said exactly the same thing. So
Interesting.
it's the IEA STEP scenario. And then we go to Alberta. So those would be the three governments that are mostly involved in energy policy.
Hmm.
And Alberta, we've known for a long
This won't
time
be a
where
shock.
Danielle Smith sits. She is the most not only status quo, she believes and has said I've asked her questions in press conference, and she said OPEC. OPEC's bullish view of growth out to 2050 is the way that she looks at it. So essentially, what we've got is we're embarking on this major expansion in Canada, LNG and pipelines and natural gas growth and all of that. And we're only looking at the optimistic scenarios. We're not taking into account the risk associated with scenarios that show a decline after 2030.
Right.
So, and the decline will be driven by the rise of electricity on both the demand side and the supply side. So all those new devices like electric vehicles and heat pumps and industrial processes will begin to push out internal combustion engines and gas furnaces in our homes and heat and boilers and gas turbines and all of that kind of stuff. And so this is the fundamental divide between the views of energy. Is it going to continue mostly the way it's going, and all new forms of energy will add to, but not displace? Or are we going to electrify everything? And then, first the electricity will take the growth, and then when it's got 100% of the growth, then it'll start pushing out fossil fuels out of the energy system, and you'll see oil and gas start to decline in the 2030s. And here at Energy Media, based on all of the work that we've done, we think that uh, the APS view that we're going to see a peak and decline in the 2030s. That is, we think, is the most likely. And we talked to, like Chris Bataille, he thinks that way. So this is why we push back so hard against, the oil and gas industry and against the governments, is because we don't think they're assessing risk of change in their policy framework. And that spells big trouble for stranded assets and
Right.
loss of taxpayer dollars and so on. So I know it's a long-winded but explanation, but I think it's important now that we
Yeah.
think about framing the conversation differently.
Well, and I think the way the leaders are framing it for us is they're saying there's going to be this gradual shift. We've got tons of time. This thing is just going to kind of flow into 2050, and we're going to have this transition from fossil fuels to electricity, and everything's going to be a-okay. And I don't think that they are, maybe anticipating that disruption and displacement that we've seen in the past. Historical um, kind of examples have taught us that disruption is a thing. And so, so we can look at, we've talked about Blockbuster, we've talked about people who have basically ignored that there's this big transition coming until obviously it's too late. And so that's what I saw from that story, really.
I want to make this point before we go on to the next story. Canada at this moment is Blockbuster. We see the changes coming. We see electric vehicles and we see heat pumps and all of those new energy technologies, and we don't think it's going to be disruptive.
Right.
That's the mistake that Blockbuster made with regard to Netflix. They actually were going to buy it in 2006. They looked at the business model and they said, "Oh no, nobody's going to ever, streaming video. That's just not going to work. Nobody's going to be interested in that." 4 years later, they were bankrupt. Their management made a key mistake and they misjudged the whether streaming video was a disruption or not. That's the mistake they made. And the analogy here is that Canadian policymakers and industry are making a similar mistake in misjudging the rise of electricity, and renewables and the electric devices that will displace combustion devices. That's the essential, and we're making that mistake. And that's what we do at Energy Media is we try to alert people what's coming and the dangers and risk involved for the Canadian economy.
Well, that leads right into our next story where you interviewed the Ember Energy team about this new report that they put out, that there's, this new they're framing the energy debate in a new way. So maybe you can introduce that for us.
Yeah, Kingsmill Bond, Dan Walter, and Sam Butler Sloss at Energy Media, sorry, at Ember Energy, have been putting out reports now for a little while. They all came over from Rocky Mountain Institute about a year ago. And the the latest one is about the rise of electrotech and what a revolution it's going to be. Now, here's electrotech sounds like one of those, oh my God, and I have to learn another
Term.
yeah, another term. Here's what it is. On the supply side, it's essentially wind and solar and batteries. So how we produce electricity so that's cleaner, cheaper, and more flexible and more useful that's the supply side. On the demand side, we're talking about devices that use electricity directly. So we're not
Right.
talking about devices like oil, for example, where you combust the oil first in an internal combustion engine, and then the ice then turns it into energy that propels your car forward. Or
Mhm.
you combust it in a gas furnace and you heat your house. Or you
Right.
combust it in a steel plant and then you create heat and you melt iron and so on to make steel. It's, so that's we're not talking about combustion. We're talking about electricity, and those two things are generally considered electrotech. But they introduced a third one, which I think is really useful, and I hadn't thought of this before. They talk about the connection between the two. So we're talking power grids, we're talking batteries, we're talking digital controls, we're talking new materials, we're talking all of those. AI would be another big one. And
Right.
this is really techie kind of stuff that electrical engineers and grid engineers talk about, but it's an important part of the equation because you have to connect the demand to the supply somehow, and that's where all these other new technologies are doing. They're not radically new. It's not like we don't haven't had transmission lines and batteries before or whatever
Right.
power grids, but they're changing, and there are new technologies coming in to change them. And so they put out this report. It's like 122 pages of
Yeah.
data. It's
Hmm.
it's it's mind-boggling complex. And so we've been going through it, and we did a bunch of interviews with Dan Walter, and then a bunch of interviews with Kingsmill Bond, and we're slowly going through the report. And you're going to see those. We've created a new playlist on our YouTube channel called Electrotech Revolution Explained. And all of those interviews, you can find them there. And we've kept them down to, like 6 minutes, 10 minutes. We've kept them fairly short and digestible. And you don't have to sit there for an hour or two. You can take them when it's convenient for you.
Yeah, and I think what was big impression on me at least was, we're looking at big oil and big tech now. These aren't little companies introducing a little gadget here and there. These are well-established technologies. And I think sometimes when we're thinking about electric tech or, the energy transition in general, we're thinking, oh, well, there's going to be these little things that are going to come along. And this paper is definitely talking about a much broader view, a much bigger picture analysis. So for me, it was bringing together a lot of different things.
Yeah, and there's a key point here that, okay, so we have all this technology, it's changing the global energy system, but there's also a divide at the geopolitical level and the economic level, and that's between the United States, sort of the West and China. And
Yeah.
because what China did 15, 20 years ago is on all of these technologies, they began to invest in the manufacture of those technologies. And over the course of time, they have invested hundreds of billions of dollars in scaling up the manufacture of solar panels, of wind turbines, of batteries, electric vehicles, all of that stuff. And that has driven the cost down. As you scale up, your costs come down, you have learning curves and so on. And then China is now at the point where they utterly dominate the supply of and the global supply
Right.
chains. So the question becomes how, and I should mention too, thanks to President Donald Trump in the United States, they have doubled down on oil and gas for sure, and some coal. And so the U.S. and then Canada has kind of followed suit in a way, even though Trump is pushing us and we're trying to push back against his tariffs. We've kind of taken the same approach. We're not on energy. We're not that dissimilar in some ways to the Trump energy dominance doctrine. So
Yeah.
the way this lines up is that the U.S. has picked oil and gas and coal, and China has picked renewables and electrotech, and now they're fighting it out they're competing in the global economy. And what the fundamental mistake was not made by Trump, it was made by Joe Biden. When he put all of those tariffs in early 2024, tariffs on EVs, tariffs on solar panels, what he did is he encouraged China to pivot from the West to the global South. Now, they were already in the global South. It's not like this is brand spanking new, but in a big, big way. And so
Yeah.
all of a sudden now we're seeing China exporting huge amounts of EVs and batteries and solar panels. And the solar
Yeah.
panels are so cheap, they're actually already in a very short time affecting things like the power grid in Pakistan. You know, they
Yeah.
in 1 year they put so many solar panels on rooftops that demand for the grid in Pakistan dropped by 9%. And you're seeing this all over the place because cheap Chinese electrotech is allowing the place like Africa, but not even Africa so much. It's Asia. Asia is really where the action is happening. Then to a lesser extent in Latin America, and you see
Right.
them leapfrogging over the old system. And that's a
Yeah.
fundamental assumption. Like the OPEC and OPEC is very explicit about this. They say that the global South will follow in the footsteps of the West. It will use the same fuel and the same technologies. So instead of leapfrogging like they did with telecommunications, they didn't put in landlines. They went right to cell phones,
Mobiles.
to
Yep.
mobiles. OPEC says no, that's not going to happen. They're going to stick with fossil fuels. But China is demonstrating that this technology now is so cheap and so good that there's lots of evidence that those global South emerging economies are already beginning to leapfrog. They're
Yeah.
they're they're not going to increase their fossil fuel consumption. So
Yeah. And this is a clear example of where we're seeing the energy transition is really about economics. This is where people are choosing the thing that's cheaper, not about any, values around the environment or around climate change or anything else. This is about economics, and I think it's a very, clear example where we're seeing the OPEC model kind of starting to fall apart in front of us, and this also makes me question why aren't Canadian leaders seeing this in the same way? Like getting back to our first story. I also
I have a
wanted to,
hypothesis about that.
yeah, tell me about
And it's
it.
not radical and it's kind of obvious actually, but don't ever underestimate the impact of greed because
Yes.
um, Alberta is the best example of this because they not only get tax revenue, they also get royalties. And it's a huge part of their provincial budget. And so when oil prices drop, their revenue drops. And then now, they went from having a surplus last year. Now it looks like they're going to have a deficit this year. So why are the various governments, federal, BC, Alberta, pushing oil and gas so hard? It's because it generates a ton of revenue for them. And they need that. So if you're Mark Carney, you're the prime minister, and you've promised you're going to invest, 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 you're going to build, 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 you're going to do it faster than you've ever done before, you have to pay for it. And he's an
Yeah.
economist, right? So he would prefer, and he's a former central banker. He would prefer not to do it with debt. And so by building out oil and gas, he generates not only revenue for the provincial governments, but also a lot of extra tax revenue for the federal government. And so that's, if you're looking for a primary motive, why they look at the rosy scenarios, that's it. It's driven by this, you know, their eyes are as big as saucers. You know, they're thinking about the revenue.
Well, I hope they're watching when we talk about this next story where you talk about wind and solar take over 93% of new power generation in 2024. Because to me, that was like a real eye opener. I had no idea that wind and solar have been growing exponentially. Kingsmill Bond explains it in the video. I mean, I think this is one of those ones that's a little bit shorter, and I think it's a must watch for everyone because this is where we really get into this when you're looking at the system from, a bigger perspective, bigger bird's eye view or whatever. I'm really hoping that Mark Carney catches this one.
Here's some irony. Kingsmill told me a couple of years ago, he said, Markham, the wind and solar and all, they're not going to take over right away, but they will take increasing amounts of the growth in demand. They will supply
Right.
the increasing amounts. And and he said eventually they'll get to 100%, and then they'll do more than 100%, and they'll start eating away into fossil fuel share of consumption. And so what did we see at the global level? Last year, wind and solar and batteries took 93% of all new generation capacity. Okay, so we're getting very close to that point where to 100% we're going to start seeing declines. But here's the kicker. I did a story on how in the United States that exactly 93% of new power generation capacity in the US last year. And
Yeah.
and here's why that's important. This is fascinating. So and by the way, this U.S. Energy Association technical briefings, press briefings that I've been on for a couple of years are really fascinating because they get every briefing, they get four or five U.S. utility executives, or they might be for a company, for like an actual utility. Sometimes they're an industry association, but whatever. These are the movers and shakers who are actually decision makers in the U.S. power grid. And I've watched them get more and more nervous because what they're seeing is really rapid growth in demand. It was flat from 2008, the big financial crisis, to just recently. It was flat. Nobody grew. Didn't grow in
Right.
Canada, didn't grow in the United States. That's what they're used to. All of a sudden now they're looking at growth rates of 3 to 4 to 5%, which in the power grid world, in the utility world, is like crazy growth.
Yeah.
It's
It's
crazy
huge.
growth. Yeah. And in some states, I even saw an estimate of 14%. And so they go, okay, now clearly we've got to get some more power generation. We've got to put up some way of creating electricity. Well, nobody wants to build coal. Nobody wants to keep coal. The coal fleet in the U.S. is old and inefficient, and they just nobody wants it. It's polluting, and they want to get rid of it. So they're retiring them as quickly as they can. They would love to go to gas because gas is this plentiful, expensive though. It's 3 or 4 times what it is in Canada. So but here's the problem. There's so much demand for combined cycle gas turbines that if you ordered one today, you wouldn't get it to 2030 or 2031. So you can't just step on the
Can't get
accelerator
something up on
and
grid.
go, yeah, we're going to put a bunch of gas power generation. Can't do hydro. That takes a long time. Can't do nuclear. The nukes take they take a long time. They're over budget. That just as much as Donald Trump loves nukes, it ain't happening anytime soon. Might happen in the 2030s, but it's not the rest of this decade. All that leaves is wind and solar and batteries, the thing that is the
Right.
lowest cost uh, way to generate electricity. You can build wind and solar farms quick. You can get it, a year or two, and you can get them connected to your grid. And so the very thing that those utilities were counting on to meet that growing demand for electricity, AI data centers, right?
Correct. Yeah.
EVs, heat pumps, all growing rapidly in the US due to the market and also policy. Now Donald Trump has put enormous tariffs on those technologies, particularly with respect to China, and now their costs are going up. And they may not be able to get enough supply. They may not be able to get enough solar panels. They may not be able
Yeah.
to get enough wind turbines. They're literally tearing their hair out. What are we going to do? And I had U.S. economist Ed Hurst on the show again, and I asked Ed the question. So, if this is their dilemma, what are they going to do? And he said, well, they're going to pay the extra money uh, that the tariff adds to, say, a
Hmm.
solar panel, and customers are just going to have to pay higher prices.
Yeah.
And that's just either that or not have enough generation capacity and look at blackouts and brownouts and outages and so on. So the point of the piece I did is that the electric revolution is going on in the United States, whether Donald Trump likes it or not.
Yeah.
And it's going to be markets and customers and that drive it. It's not going to
Yeah.
be climate policy. We need to get our heads away from climate policy. We're not doing this to reduce emissions, which is a laudable ideal here at Energy Media. We
Yeah.
don't dispute climate science at all. But the whole point behind climate policy was to say, let's switch over the global energy system to clean technologies, electric technologies. And now that's happening. So
Right.
let's,
Well, and I
yeah.
think you're hitting it on the head when you also covered last week a report around Canada's greenhouse gas emissions haven't improved overall, and we've had these type of climate focused policies, or at least they've been framed as climate focused policies like the carbon tax, and the outcomes have obviously not done the trick. We haven't seen our emissions go down, so that's where the shift and what we've been talking about is happening here. We're talking about an economic shift that hopefully we will see a difference. I'm not sure.
Well, I think if I'm remembering my numbers correctly, I think we peaked at 714 megatons nationally, 728, something there, and we're now at like 694.
Right.
So the yes, we are a little lower than we were. And a lot of that comes out of the power sector because we've squeezed coal pretty much out of the Canadian power grids. We've had a very tiny decline in transportation, but oil and gas emissions have gone way up, and it's because we're producing more of it. The oil sands
Yeah.
is driving all of that growth because it has added every year. It goes up by 100 or 100, 200,000 barrels a day of production. So you're just adding more emissions into the total. And I interviewed economist Dave Sawyer, who worked on this report for the Canadian Climate Institute. And Dave's very well versed in carbon markets and emissions. And so we talked about all of this. And my takeaway from that, MC, is that we stop we stop focusing on climate policy.
Yeah.
Stop, the carbon tax. I know economists love the carbon tax. They absolutely, they're pulling their hair out. They go, "Oh my God, if you just gave it a chance, it would reduce emissions." Well, you know what? With carbon pricing, you have to build political support for it. And the Trudeau government didn't do that. And
Yeah.
so now we have Mark Carney, the
Yeah.
great climate finance guru of the last 10 years, becomes prime minister. And the first thing he does is axe the tax, right? He ends the carbon tax. And now we have the oil and gas industry pushing really hard to eliminate the industrial emitters carbon tax.
Right.
They want that gone. And now every time some little thing comes up, you see the oil and gas bulls on social media going, oh my God, we need to get rid of this regulation. We need to get, it's clean energy regulate, clean electricity regulation, or it's the clean fuel standard, or whatever it is.
Mhm.
And so the support for climate policy is falling, and governments are starting to. So our suggestion is go with the flow. Industrial policy plus electrification of the economy is the way to go. And I'll illustrate what I mean by that. So industrial policies are those policies that encourage the creation of manufacturing of new technologies. Like China is a good example of this, but this kind of approach goes back hundreds of years. This is not like it was invented. It's just it gets recycled and we do it differently. So what
Right.
China did is it said, you know what, we want to manufacture solar panels, wind turbines, batteries, and EVs. So we're going to put a pile of money into scaling up the manufacturing, but they have a big market, right? And it's not well developed. So then they put a similar kind of investment on the demand side. And so that Chinese consumers could buy EVs and buy batteries, and they would buy electricity generated and buy a lot of rooftop solar, I should add. And so they boosted these new energy technologies on the supply side and on the
Right.
demand side, and to use Ember Energy's framing on the connection between the two, big, in the power grids and distribution and so on. And and that's what I'm suggesting for Canada. Like we have an EV mandate, and the federal government has paused it. So the question I posed was, why have an EV mandate if all you're doing is trying to decarbonize your transportation sector? Why don't you link that policy to the development of an EV industry, manufacturing industry in Canada? So that if you're going to subsidize something, like we had a $7,500 federal rebate,
Right.
it's to buy a Canadian made EV.
Yeah.
That makes a lot more sense to me. And then
Yeah.
you develop that industry, and then if you have a critical minerals, great, you mine it, and then you smelt it and refine it into battery metals, and then you do that in Canada, then you make, batteries in Canada, which we already have announced, plants like Volkswagen is doing that. So take the manufacturing sector and work your way back through the supply chains, and it should be a strategy to do that. And
Yeah.
essentially, what you're doing is you have these clean energy technologies. We need to grow the power grid, and most provinces are doing that with wind and solar and batteries tied to hydro, the big ones anyway. And so we're already looking at boosting the supply side with clean electricity. So make the switch on the demand side, and on the connection side, we need a national power grid, we need investment in distribution and so on. And then what you do is you attract investment into new industries and new businesses that are in the supply chain, and you create jobs, and you create business opportunities, and you create tax
Hmm.
revenue. Instead of just buying EVs from some other place, you've actually now stimulated some diversification of your own economy. And at the same time, while you electrify it, your emissions go down. So
Right.
I think industrial policy plus electrification is a far more effective way, and I think Canadians will support it more than just climate policy.
Yeah, and you're creating some national pride, which I think shifts us right into. I want to shift focus now and talk a little bit about your interview with Charlie Angus, my favorite former MP from Timmins James Bay. He's got his new Substack, The Resistance, which has just caught on like wildfire since I'm not sure, has it been around for about 6 months now? And he talked a lot about his growing following, and how he's trying to make these political movements happen, and how he felt like it was a bit of his natural calling moving forward.
Charlie Angus is, first of all, a smart dude, and he's very
Yes.
well read. He's very well read, and his analyses of what's going on with the mega culture down in the States and Trump and
Charlie
all the
Kirk.
crazy stuff going on down there,
Hmm.
and how that has drifted across the border. And now we have, what he calls the Maple MAGA, and we have Alberta,
Right.
the populism and so on. But he's also a firebrand. He's a real fiery guy. He's very
Yeah.
passionate, and and a very interesting speaker, and people love that. That's they see it on on the right side of on the populist side of the political spectrum. On the is it authoritarian and fascist? Maybe it is. We've dealt with that in other stories as well. But anyway, Charlie Angus is an interesting guy, and people want to listen to him and watch him. So we had him on, and we talked about politics and culture, and what Canada is doing, and particularly how he's pushing back against the MAGA influence in Canadian politics and organizing and mobilizing Canadians. So we'll have Charlie back in on a regular basis. He likes coming and talking about what he's doing, but there's a lot of value in this because the non-MAGA folks, Canadians, we've been complacent for way too long. And it's
Yeah.
so some of it is complacency, like my generation, the tail end of the boomers.
Yeah.
We've had it good for a long, long time. And we just assume that it's going to continue off into the future. And this goes into the next story that we're going to talk about, my interview with Frank Graves,
Yeah.
because the younger generation in Canada, under 35, we got a crisis, folks. This is a really serious problem. Folks under 35 don't have the same opportunities. Their perception of the economy and their future is so dark and pessimistic. And
Hmm.
this comes out clearly in Frank's polling data, national polling data.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so they think that their economic future is going to be much worse than their parents. They won't be able to buy a home. They're putting off marriage and having a family. They're not spending on things like automobiles and what have you because it's a tough road to hoe for a lot of them.
Hmm.
They're having to work hard. They have to pay higher education expenses, on and on and on. So they have we have a crisis of confidence, a crisis of uh, national pride, whatever it is, but we've got a problem. And Frank outlined that very clearly. And here's the point. Let's tie Frank and Charlie together. When Trump has taught us this in spades. When people are disaffected, they're angry, and they're because their circumstances have changed, they are then way more open to the kind of populism and
Yeah.
authoritarian populism that Trump espouses. And we have the same kind of situation brewing in Canada with our,
Yeah.
folks that are our citizens that are under 35. We need to pay attention to that, and we need to put in place policies that create jobs for them and restores their faith in a good lifestyle and prosperity in Canada for it's kind of a middle class lifestyle. And so Frank brought the data, Charlie
Hmm.
brought the fire and the political
Yeah.
analysis, and the two of them together, it's a compelling vision for change. We can't continue to go on the way we are. We're going to be in big trouble here in Canada.
Well, I think I just want to mention one more thing about the about that data. And for me, it was the gender differences as well as the regional differences. For me, that was pretty interesting. Looking at the regional differences where, Alberta showed this real kind of economic despair, which in general you think, or maybe it's part of, sorry, I've got a fly buzz in my head here, same one that must have kept me up all night. Um, Anyways, it was that economic despair, in Alberta's young people, and you think, okay, but that's the place that, people from Newfoundland to Ontario have been traveling for years to go make a buck. In the oil sands. So for me, that's a real shift, I think, to think about, Alberta that way. And then the differences between young men and young women, young women really being focused, first of all, young women being better educated and really focused on social issues, whereas young men are kind of spiraling down that that path of disinformation, if you will, or misinformation, distrust for our government. So those are scary when you start to think of what we see going on in the US. And obviously there's people here that are vulnerable to kind of buying into those narratives.
We only touched on this a little bit in the interview with Frank, and
Yeah,
there are lots of tropes out there, lots of narratives that you should see on social media about what's happening to young men,
yeah,
and it's well, so women are better educated. They have their own incomes. They're buying houses. They're buying cars. They're and the men are being left behind. And instead of choosing a different path, maybe going to college or whatever, they're falling down this rabbit hole of, radicalization. The
yeah,
young men are being radicalized at a much higher rate than young women are. And that becomes a real problem then because they support, authoritarian populism like we see with Donald Trump, and to some extent we see with Danielle Smith in Alberta. It's a really
right.
serious problem. And Frank's point is that the trend is clear. There's no disputing the data now, and it's getting worse over time, which
Yeah,
is, given what we see in the US, is exactly what you'd think. The problem for us is because this is not a beat for us. This is one of those things that is
yeah,
interesting. We think our audience is going to like it, and we apply our journalism model of interviewing experts, as kind of almost a service to our audience. But this whole difference between men and women, modern young men and women, it needs further exploration by us because men are bitter and angry. You see them going down those rabbit holes. Women aren't happy because they're not seeing that they think the men aren't stepping up.
yeah.
So there's conflict there. I don't know how, but we need to explore that more because we've just touched the edge of it. Anyway, changes in the wind, folks. Whether it's with the economy, whether it's the energy system, whether it's social and political, changes in the wind. And I think the one message you can take from all of these stories we talked about, MC, is that citizens, Canadians, need to be more engaged.
Yeah. Yeah, we need to take this time to kind of reflect and also, as we say, write our leaders, write a letter, get engaged, know the facts so you can talk to your neighbors and your friends and your colleagues at the water cooler. That's part of what we're trying to do here is change the conversation. So if you like our show, please like and subscribe to the channel. You can catch us over on the Energi Media Facebook page. And we also have TikTok and Instagram. So, wherever you are, you can also connect with daily highlights from coming out from Markham's show, as well as other things that we're posting on the website. So thanks, Markham, again for this week. And I guess we'll say see you next week.
We should talk a little bit about what's going on this week. We're looking at
Oh,
getting
yeah.
Michael Dunn in, who's
Oh,
a
that's
former
great.
GM executive in
Hmm.
Asia and now a consultant. He's going to talk about what's going on in China, particularly, but also in Asia, other Asian countries, with the rise of the EV industry and how Asia has just completely taken over the global auto industry. Right? I mean, it's disrupted it in a huge way. But then on the weekend, on Friday, just before the weekend, we're going to be talking to Colin McCarricker, who is the Canadian who's in charge of Bloomberg NEF's electric, transportation sector. All kinds of this is, and I've talked to Colin in the past about the methodology they use. Because they
Hmm.
use some of the same technology adoption theory and methods that we use here when
Right.
we're tracking change in the global energy system. So I always
Hmm.
like talking to Colin because they go out and talk to the manufacturers, and the folks in the industry as well as look at the data. And I find Bloomberg NEF's his team's work is top notch. They're really good. And they line up more with the IEA, way more, much closer to the IEA than they do to, like the US EIA or OPEC. So watch for those. Michael Dunn and Colin McCarricker, if you're interested in EVs and electric transportation, those are going to be great interviews.
I didn't know Michael Dunn was coming on. I'm a huge Michael Dunn fan, so I'm really looking forward to that.
Yeah, he's not shy, is he?
No, I love, and he always has some interesting insights that I really enjoy whenever he's on the show. So thanks everyone. And oh, did you have one? You want me to pass? I'm going to give you the final word today.
Well, thank you very much, folks. We really appreciate your support, and we I know we ask for this all the time, and then I get busy, and I don't always follow through with my promises. I apologize for that. But send comments, email us. MC will give you the email address. Email us, comment on threads, DM us if you're able, and give us your comments, and we'll try to answer some of those because everybody has lots of questions. Oh, and we should mention we're going to have a Facebook Live tomorrow, which will
Yes.
probably and eventually the idea is to make it YouTube Live as well at the same time.
Yeah,
So
I
you'll have,
we're going to try to do it YouTube Live tomorrow. We're going to try to do both platforms at
oh,
the same time.
there you go.
So Facebook Live for sure, and hopefully you on our followers on YouTube will also get the notification.
The email I mentioned. What's
Oh,
the
it's
email
the
where
energy
people can?
show at gmail.com, and it's energy, same way energy media is spelled. So ENERGI.
Great. Thanks a lot, folks. We'll see you next week.
Okay. Take care.